November 1944. A hillside somewhere in the Lorraine region of eastern France. Sergeant Mike Romano grips the controls of his M4 Sherman, staring up at a slope that rises maybe 30 degrees in front of him. Standard armor doctrine is carved into his brain after 16 weeks of training at Fort Knox. When climbing hills, keep your glacis plate pointed upward toward the enemy. Maximum armor angle. Maximum protection. Behind him, in the turret, his gunner Carl Brewster mutters something about German 88mm guns hidden somewhere in the tree line at the crest. Those guns have already knocked out 2 Shermans from their company this morning. Frontal armor, both times. The crews never had a chance. Romano makes a decision that violates every manual he's ever read. He throws the Sherman into reverse, spins the tank around backward, and starts climbing that hill rear end first. His driver thinks he's lost his mind. The company commander, watching through binoculars 300 yards back, is already composing the court-martial paperwork in his head. Then, an 88 round screams in from the ridge line. It hits Romano's Sherman on the rear plate at a 45-degree angle. The tungsten cord projectile, capable of punching through 4 inches of vertical armor at 1,000 yards, glances off like a stone skipping across water. The deflection sends it careening harmlessly into the dirt 20 feet to the left. Romano keeps reversing up that hill. 2 more rounds impact his rear plate, both deflect. His Sherman crests the ridge, turret traverses, and Brewster puts a 75mm round straight into the 88's position before the German crew can reload. What Romano discovered that day would spread through American armored units like wildfire. A tactical innovation so counterintuitive that it took desperate men under fire to even attempt it. The mathematics were simple, the survival rate was remarkable, and the explanation required understanding something fundamental about how armor actually works versus how everyone assumed it worked. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The M4 Sherman's armor specifications were well documented and universally understood as inadequate by late 1944. The glacis plate, that sloped front section protecting the driver and transmission, measured 63mm thick at 47 degrees from vertical on most Sherman variants. The M4A3 models, which began arriving in Europe during summer of 1944, featured a revised front hull with 63mm at 47 degrees, giving an effective thickness of roughly 93mm against perpendicular hits. The turret front varied by production model, but averaged 76mm at roughly vertical. The hull sides measured 38mm at 0 degrees, completely vertical. The rear plate measured 38mm at 9 degrees from vertical, meaning it was nearly straight up and down. On paper, these numbers spelled disaster against German anti-tank weapons. The PaK 43 88mm gun, mounted in fixed positions, on tank destroyers like the Nashorn, and famously on the Tiger II King Tiger, could penetrate 150mm of vertical armor at 1,000 meters using standard armor-piercing rounds. Against a Sherman's 63mm frontal glacis, the 88 had massive overmatch capability. The tungsten cord Panzer 40 penetrating tracer round could punch through 193mm at 1,000 meters. Even at extreme range, 2,000 meters or more, an 88 could reliably penetrate any face of a Sherman from any angle. American tankers knew these numbers intimately. They'd lost too many friends not to know them. But there was another set of numbers that didn't appear in any German gunnery manual because German doctrine never anticipated facing them. These were the deflection angles, the precise geometry of what happened when a shell struck armor that wasn't perpendicular to the round's path. Armor penetration wasn't just about thickness, it was about the angle of impact. A projectile striking armor at 90 degrees, perfectly perpendicular, delivered 100% of its kinetic energy directly into defeating the plate. The same projectile striking at 60 degrees, 30 degrees off perpendicular, had to penetrate through effectively twice the thickness because it was travelling at an angle through the plate rather than straight through. At 45 degrees from perpendicular, Effective thickness increased by roughly 40%. Below 30 degrees, something different started happening. The physics became less about penetration and more about deflection. The shell's hardened penetrator, designed to punch through metal by focused kinetic force, instead encountered a surface angled so severely that the impact forces redirected the projectile rather than allowing it to bite into the plate. This was called ricochet or bounce in tanker terminology. Ballistics engineers used the term critical ricochet angle. For most World War II armor-piercing ammunition against hardened steel armor, that critical angle fell somewhere between 20 and 30 degrees, from perpendicular depending on shell design, velocity, and armor quality. Below that threshold, rounds tended to deflect rather than penetrate, even when the shell theoretically had enough energy to punch through. The Sherman's rear armor plate, 38 mm at 9 degrees from vertical, created unusual geometric possibilities. When a Sherman climbed a hill in the normal forward configuration, its glacis plate angled upward toward the enemy. This increased the effective thickness against rounds coming from elevated positions, which was good. But the rear plate angled away, essentially presenting its vertical face to the threat, which was irrelevant since the rear faced downhill away from danger. When a Sherman reversed up that same hill, the geometry inverted. Now the thin rear plate faced upward toward the enemy. But here's the critical factor. As the tank climbed at steeper angles, that rear plate's relationship to incoming fire changed dramatically. On flat ground, the rear plate sat at 9 degrees from vertical. A round coming in horizontally hit at 81 degrees from perpendicular, well within penetration range. But on a 30-degree slope with the tank reversed, the rear plate's angle relative to level ground became 39 degrees from vertical. An incoming horizontal shot now hit at 51 degrees from perpendicular, still within the penetration zone for an 88, but much closer to the critical ricochet threshold. At 45-degree slopes, which were common in the Vosges Mountains and Huertgen forest fighting, the math became even more favorable. The rear plate angled at 54 degrees from vertical. Horizontal fire hit at 36 degrees from perpendicular. Now the Sherman sat right at the edge of ricochet probability. Throw in even slight variations in the enemy gun's depression angle, minor irregularities in the armor plate surface, or the Sherman's hull angle shifting as it climbed over uneven terrain, and deflections became increasingly likely. This wasn't theoretical physics confined to ballistics laboratories. This was practical geometry that desperate tankers stumbled into by accident and desperation. The first documented case came from the 2nd Armoured Division during fighting near Saint-Lô in late July 1944. A platoon from Company B, 66th Armoured Regiment, found itself pinned by 88 fire from fortified positions on a ridgeline. The Germans had clear fields of fire across 500 yards of open farmland. 3 Shermans attempting to advance forward had been knocked out in rapid succession. The platoon commander, First Lieutenant James Bates, recognized they couldn't win a frontal slugging match. He also knew from earlier reconnaissance that a sunken farm road ran up the left side of the ridge, providing some defilade from direct fire until the final 200-yard approach. Bates led his remaining 4 tanks up that farm road, moving forward until they reached the base of the final slope. German fire intensified. 1 Sherman took a hit on the turret that killed the loader and jammed the gun traverse. Bates, according to his after-action report filed August 2, 1944, made what he termed an instinctive decision based on no tactical doctrine he'd ever been taught. He ordered his tank into reverse and started backing up the hill. His logic was simple, and in his own words, desperate. The Germans were shooting down and at him from elevated positions. His thin top armor couldn't take those plunging hits, but if he reversed up the slope, his rear deck, which was angled, might fare better than his glacis plate, which would be pointing uselessly at the sky. The logic wasn't quite right. Bates had confused rear deck angle with rear plate angle, but the instinct saved his life. 2 88 rounds hit his Sherman's rear plate during the climb. Both deflected. Bates crested the ridge, His gunner engaged the 88 position at point-blank range from an unexpected angle, and the platoon secured the objective. In his after-action report, Bates noted the deflections but attributed them to luck or possibly defective German ammunition. He didn't yet understand the geometry at work. His company commander filed the report without particular comment. Just another day of confused small unit action in the hedgerows. But word spread through the tank crews themselves. Bates's driver and gunner told other men, in the maintenance area that night. Reversing up hills somehow worked against 88s. Within a week, other crews in 2nd Armoured started trying it. Some got deflections, some didn't. Nobody understood the pattern yet, but a seed had been planted. The tactic got its first systematic analysis in early September 1944, not from Army Ordnance engineers or tactical doctrine writers, but from a maintenance officer trying to understand damage patterns. Captain Robert Earley commanded the forward maintenance company attached to 4th Armoured Division. His job involved inspecting every knocked-out or damaged tank the division sent back, documenting the hits, determining what was repairable, and tracking patterns that might inform tactical recommendations. By September 5th, Earley had personally examined 43 Shermans with battle damage from the division's drive across France. His reports noted something unusual. 7 tanks showed impact marks on rear armour, plates that hadn't penetrated, gouges, scraped paint, deformation, but no penetration. This was strange because rear armour was the thinnest on the Sherman. Hits there usually meant catastrophic penetration and dead crews. Early started interviewing the crews whose tanks showed these non-penetrating rear hits. 4 of the 7 crews reported they'd been reversing uphill when struck. 1 crew had been reversing on flat ground during a fighting withdrawal and took a penetrating hit that killed 2 men. 2 other crews couldn't remember their exact orientation during the engagement. The pattern was suggestive, but not conclusive. Earley, who'd studied mechanical engineering at Lehigh University before the war, sketched out the geometry in his maintenance log. He calculated that a Sherman on a 40-degree slope with rear-facing upslope would present its rear plate at roughly 49 degrees from vertical, meaning incoming fire would hit at roughly 41 degrees from perpendicular, close to ricochet threshold for 88mm rounds. He wrote up his findings and submitted them through channels on September 8th, with a recommendation that the tactic be tested under controlled conditions. His report went to 4th Armoured Division headquarters, then to 12 Corps headquarters, then apparently disappeared into the staff bureaucracy somewhere at 3rd Army. George Patton's command was racing across France at that moment, advancing so rapidly that tactical innovation took a back seat to basic logistics of fuel and ammunition supply. Nobody at the higher command levels paid attention to a maintenance captain's speculation about armour angles. But down at company level, where men lived and died based on what actually worked, the tactic kept spreading. By October, crews in the 4th, 6th and 7th Armoured Divisions were regularly reversing up slopes when under fire from elevated positions. Most didn't understand why it helped. They just knew from crew reports and scuttlebutt that reversed tanks seemed to survive hits better than forward-facing ones. The German defenders started noticing too. Intelligence reports from October and November captured from German units mentioned American tanks displaying unusual behavior, backing up hills in reverse, apparently attempting to use terrain differently than expected. Some German after-action reports speculated this was a breakdown in American training, crews panicking and reversing instead of advancing. Others noted more accurately that the tactics seemed deliberate and mentioned frustration with rounds failing to penetrate. A report from the 11th Panzer Division dated October 23, 1944, specifically mentioned engagement with American medium tanks near Chateau Salins, where multiple 88 rounds struck rear. Armour without decisive penetration. The report attributed this to ammunition quality issues or crew error in range estimation, not to the tactical, the geometry involved. By November, the technique had acquired a name among American tankers. They called it backing up, or sometimes us first, crude but descriptive. Training manuals said nothing about it. Officer candidate schools never mentioned it. But crew commanders taught it to new replacements in the field because it worked often enough to be worth trying. The first official doctrinal analysis came from an unexpected source. In late November 1944, a British liaison officer attached to 1st Army Headquarters, Major Anthony Beasley of the Royal Tank Regiment, submitted a tactical bulletin based on observations of American armour operations in the Hurtgen Forest. Beasley had spent 3 weeks riding with units from 1st Infantry Division's attached armour. He'd watched Sherman crews adopt unorthodox tactics to survive in the forest's steep ravines and ridgelines, where German anti-tank guns dominated from prepared positions. His report, titled Observations on American Medium Tank Employment in Close Terrain, included a full section on what he called the reversed slope climb technique. Beasley's analysis was more thorough than Early's had been. He'd interviewed over 30 tank commanders who'd used the tactic. He'd examined wreckage and impact patterns. He'd done rough calculations of armour angles at various slopes. His conclusions were careful but clear. Against anti-tank fire from elevated positions, reversing up slopes of 30 degrees or greater appeared to significantly increase deflection probability for the Sherman's rear plate while maintaining adequate turret traverse for return fire. He recommended controlled testing and possible inclusion in tactical training materials. Beasley's report reached the desk of Lieutenant Colonel Wilson Hawkins, who commanded the 1st Army Provisional Tank Training Centre at Verviers, Belgium. Hawkins, a pre-war cavalry officer who'd transitioned to armour, had the authority to implement new training on his own initiative for units rotating through for rest and refit. On December 4, 1944, Hawkins authorized live-fire testing using captured German anti-tank guns and knocked out Sherman hulks positioned at various angles on a hillside range. The tests ran for 3 days using 88mm and 75mm German guns firing captured ammunition. The results were documented in detailed range reports that still exist in National Archives records. Against Sherman rear armour at 0 degrees, meaning tank and target on flat ground perpendicular, the 88 achieved 100% penetration at ranges up to 1,500 metres. At 30 degrees slope with Sherman reversed, penetration rate dropped to 73% at 500 metres, 51% at 1,000 metres. At 45 degree slopes, penetration rates fell to 41% at 500 metres, 18% at 1,000 metres. The deflections weren't guaranteed. They were probabilistic, dependent on dozens of variables, including exact impact angle, shell quality, armour hardness variations, and whether the shell hit at a slight angle to the plate's surface rather than square-on. But the tests confirmed what tankers had learned through trial and error. Reversing up steep hills dramatically increased survival probability against anti-tank fire from elevated positions. Hawkins immediately incorporated the technique into training for units passing through Verviers. Classes included simple geometry explanations using wooden models to show crews why the tactic worked. Instructors emphasized this wasn't magic armor. It was probability manipulation. You still got hit. The hits just failed to penetrate more often. Maybe 30% more often on steep slopes, maybe 50%. Still plenty of ways to die, but better odds than charging uphill forward into 88 fire. Then the Battle of the Bulge exploded across the Ardennes on December 16, 1944, and every carefully documented tactical innovation became immediately irrelevant as units scrambled to survive the German offensive. But the crews who'd learned the technique at Verviers or picked it up from veteran tankers carried that knowledge into the desperate fighting that followed. And in the frozen forests and steep-sided valleys where much of the Bulge fighting occurred, that knowledge saved lives in ways that would never make it into official histories, but mattered desperately to the men inside those thin-armoured Shermans facing German guns designed to kill them. The village of Houffalize sat in a valley where the Our the river carved through the Ardennes highlands. By January 7, 1945, it had become a crucial junction point between American forces, pushing south from the northern shoulder of the Bulge and Patton's Third Army driving north from Bastogne. The Germans held the high ground on both sides of Pedre, the valley. Their 88mm guns commanded every approach road. Task Force Hogan from the 3rd Armoured Division, drew the assignment to clear the eastern ridgeline. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Hogan had 21 Sherman tanks, 2 platoons of armoured infantry and half-tracks, and perfect knowledge that the mission was nearly impossible. The ridge rose almost 300 feet above the valley floor, with slopes averaging 35 to 40 degrees. German positions were dug in at the crest with interlocking fields of fire. Hogan had lost 11 tanks in the previous week to those 88s. Standard doctrine said, "Don't attack uphill into prepared anti-tank positions. You'll lose your entire force before reaching effective range." But Patton wanted that ridge by nightfall, and arguing with Patton was a fast route to unemployment. Hogan gathered his tank commanders in a burned-out barn at 0400 hours that morning. He spread a map on a wooden table lit by a demarcation, single kerosene lamp, and explained a plan that sounded insane. They would attack in 3 waves. First wave would advance forward normally to draw German fire and identify gun positions. Second wave would swing wide right using a ravine for cover, then assault the ridge from the flank, backing up the slopes. Third wave would provide overwatch and suppressive fire. When Captain Edmund Tracy, commanding Baker Company, asked why in God's name they'd reverse up slopes into enemy fire, Hogan pulled out a wrinkled technical bulletin he'd received 2 weeks earlier from First Army. It was Hawkins' training memo about deflection angles. Hogan had studied it, dismissed it as theoretical nonsense, then filed it away. Until he'd talked to a sergeant in maintenance who'd survived 3 rear plate hits while reversing up hills near Bastogne. The math made sense when your options were attack uphill and definitely die, or attack uphill backwards and possibly die. Hogan told his commanders they'd use a smoke for concealment during the approach, then reverse up the final slopes while keeping turrets rotated toward the threat. Speed was critical. German gunners would adjust their aim, but each adjustment took time. If they moved fast and used terrain intelligently, maybe enough tanks would survive to crest the ridge and get among the German positions. The attack kicked off at 06:15 under grey winter skies that promised more snow. First wave advanced up the main road exactly as expected. German guns opened fire at 1,200 metres. 2 Shermans exploded before they'd travelled 50 yards. The surviving tanks returned fire and withdrew, having accomplished their mission of marking enemy positions by drawing their fire. Second wave, Tracy's Baker Company with 9 tanks, swung right into the ravine under concealment from terrain and chemical smoke laid down by mortars. They advanced until the ravine petered out 600 yards from the ridge base. Then Tracy gave an order that felt like surrendering initiative to the enemy. "All tanks, reverse and back up that slope on my command." The ridge face in that sector climbed at 42 degrees, steep enough that the Sherman's engines strained even in low gear. Tracy's tank led, backing up the slope at maybe 3 miles per hour. His driver, Private First Class Anthony DeLuca, had to navigate in reverse using only his periscopes and Tracy's directions. The turret faced backward, covering the ridge crest. German gunners spotted them within seconds. The first 88 round came screaming in from 1,100 metres. It hit the lead Sherman's rear plate with a sound like a giant sledgehammer against an anvil. The round deflected upward, tumbling through the air in a lazy arc before impacting in snow 40 feet upslope. Tracy, convinced he should be dead, kept reversing. 2 more rounds hit his rear plate in the next 30 seconds. 1 deflected cleanly. 1 penetrated, but at such an angle that it failed to fully pierce the plate, instead gouging a channel through the armour that stopped just short of the interior. The tank stayed operational. Behind him, 8 more Shermans backed up that slope in a ragged line. German fire concentrated. Rounds slammed into rear plates with mechanical regularity. 3 tanks took penetrating hits that knocked them out. 1 brewed up, its ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. But 6 tanks, including Tracy's, kept climbing. The deflection rate ran maybe 40% based on post-battle damage assessment. Not ideal, still catastrophic by any reasonable standard. But 40% deflection meant 60% penetration, instead of 95% penetration from frontal attacks. That 25% difference in survival translated to 3 additional tanks reaching the crest instead of the entire force dying halfway up. Those 3 tanks cresting the ridge at 0647 made the difference. They emerged into the German positions at close range where the 88s couldn't depress their barrels low enough to engage. Tracy's gunner put a 75mm high-explosive round into the nearest 88 position from 60 yards. The other 2 Shermans engaged with machine guns and main guns, suppressing German crews long enough for third wave to advance up the main road now that the anti-tank guns were occupied. By 0730, American forces controlled the ridge. Hogan's task force had lost 9 tanks total, horrendous casualties by any measure, but post-battle analysis estimated they'd have lost 18 to 20 tanks using conventional forward assault doctrine. The reversed climb technique had cut losses by roughly 50%, just enough to make an impossible mission merely catastrophic. Word of Houffalize spread through Third Army faster than official reports could travel. Tank commanders facing similar ridge assault missions started incorporating the tactic, without waiting for doctrine approval. Some units succeeded, some got slaughtered anyway because deflection probability wasn't armor immunity, but enough crews survived encounters they shouldn't have survived, that the technique became standard practice in certain units by late January 1945. The official army didn't formally acknowledge reversed slope climbing until after the war ended. The final version of FM 17-33, Tank Gunnery, published in 1948, included a brief section on deflection angle tactics for attacking elevated positions. It noted that presenting angled armor to enemy fire by reversing up slopes could improve survivability in specific circumstances, with heavy emphasis on the word specific, and multiple warnings about reduced driver visibility and increased vulnerability to flanking fire. The manual gave no credit to Bates, Earley, Beasley, Hawkins, Hogan, Tracy, or any of the other men who'd developed the tactic under fire. Military institutions rarely credit the desperate innovations of junior officers and enlisted men. They prefer clean doctrinal development, flowing from planning staffs to field units. But tank crews knew. They passed the knowledge informally through the remaining months of the European War. Korean War tanker memoirs occasionally mention backing up hills under fire. Marine tank crews in Vietnam used similar techniques when assaulting bunker complexes on elevated positions. The specific geometry of World War II Shermans versus German 88s didn't repeat, but the underlying principle remained. Angle your armor to maximize deflection probability when facing superior firepower from elevated positions. Modern armored vehicle design incorporates these lessons into the fundamental engineering. The M1 Abrams tank features composite armor arrays set at aggressive angles, specifically to defeat kinetic penetrators through deflection and energy absorption. Reactive armor systems, used by Israeli Merkava tanks and Russian T-series vehicles, work by disrupting the geometry of impact before penetration can occur. Trophy active protection systems physically intercept incoming rounds before they reach armor. But all of this sophisticated technology rests on foundations laid by men like Mike Romano, who discovered through terrified improvisation that physics could be manipulated by tactics, that 38mm of inadequate armor could sometimes stop rounds designed to penetrate 150mm, that the difference between living and dying might be as simple as which direction you pointed your tank on a hillside. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Sherman versus German armor debate that's consumed military historians for 80 years misses the forest for the trees. Yes, German tanks had better guns and thicker armor in direct engagements. Yes, American tankers faced technical inferiority in most one-on-one encounters, but tank combat wasn't a series of medieval jousts where knights charged directly at each other until someone died. It was a complex three-dimensional problem involving terrain, positioning, combined arms, logistics, crew training, mechanical reliability, and tactical innovation by men desperately trying to survive. The reversed slope climb represented everything that made American armored forces effective, despite technical disadvantages. It was born from necessity, refined through hard experience, shared informally between crews who trusted each other more than they trusted doctrine, and implemented without waiting for permission from higher command. The men who developed it weren't trying to prove theories about armor angles and deflection mechanics. They were trying not to die. The fact that their survival instincts aligned with ballistics physics was fortunate but not accidental. Evolution favors solutions that work. Military tactics evolve the same way, through brutal selection pressure where effective techniques spread and ineffective ones die with the men who tried them. German armored forces never developed equivalent tactical adaptations because their doctrine emphasized technical superiority and offensive action. When Panthers and Tigers encountered dug-in Allied anti-tank guns, German doctrine said suppress them with artillery, outflank them with speed, or defeat them with frontal armor. The concept of deliberately presenting weaker armor to maximize deflection angles contradicted everything German armor theory taught. Soviet tanker doctrine showed similar patterns. 34 crews attacking prepared German positions faced the same geometric problems American Sherman crews encountered. Soviet solutions emphasized mass assault, accepting catastrophic losses as necessary costs. Individual tactical innovations by desperate crews probably occurred. They're documented in some Russian-language memoirs, but Soviet military culture didn't encourage bottom-up tactical development the way American culture did. The American military's willingness to adopt unauthorized field expedients reflected broader cultural attitudes about initiative and innovation. Farm boys who'd hot-rodded tractors and mechanics who'd souped-up cars approached tanks as machines that could be operated creatively rather than sacred doctrine that couldn't be questioned. When doctrine said attack forward and reality said you'll die attacking forward, American crews felt empowered to try something different. This cultural factor mattered as much as industrial production or logistics networks in explaining Allied victory. An army that can innovate tactically at company and platoon level possesses resilience that no amount of technical superiority can overcome. German forces at company level could execute doctrine brilliantly, but when doctrine failed, they often lacked the cultural permission to improvise effectively. The specific technique of reversed slope climbing had limited tactical utility. It worked only in specific terrain, against specific threats, at specific angles. Estimates suggest maybe 2% of Sherman tank engagements involved circumstances where the tactic was applicable. For the 98% of combat that involved different geometry, it provided no benefit, but that 2% represented hundreds of individual engagements where dozens of tanks and their crews survived when they otherwise wouldn't have. In a war where armored divisions lost 200% to 400% of their authorized tank strength over the course of a campaign, every technique that marginally improved survival probability accumulated into strategic significance. 3rd Armored Division entered combat in Normandy with 232 medium tanks on June 29, 1944. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, the division had lost approximately 648 Shermans as total combat losses. Another 700 had been knocked out, repaired, and returned to service. Total tank losses exceeded 275% of authorized strength. The division maintained combat effectiveness throughout this period only because replacement tanks and crews arrived continuously from rear areas. But each tank that survived through tactical innovation rather than being destroyed meant one less replacement needed from an overtaxed logistics system. Each crew that lived through a deflection they shouldn't have survived meant 5 trained men who could pass knowledge to replacements instead of 5 more casualties requiring replacement with green crews. These marginal advantages accumulated across hundreds of units over months of sustained combat into aggregate effects that helped determine the war's outcome, not decisively. The Sherman didn't win, because crews learned to back up hills, but it contributed to the broader pattern where American forces proved more adaptable, more sustainable, and more resilient than German forces despite facing technical disadvantages. The men who reversed up those hills in France, Belgium, and Germany during the winter of 1944–45 weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They weren't charging enemy positions or defending desperate perimeters. They were backing up slopes as fast as their transmissions allowed, praying that physics and probability would spare them from 88mm rounds that by all rights should have punched through their inadequate armor. Many died anyway. The deflection rate was never 100%. Plenty of rounds hit at angles that enabled penetration despite the favorable geometry. Plenty of tanks took hits in locations other than the rear plate, where the technique provided no protection. And backing up hills created its own vulnerabilities, reduced driver visibility, slower speed, and difficulty traversing rough terrain in reverse, all contributed to losses. But some men lived who would have died. Some tanks crested ridges that would have been graveyards for conventional assaults. Some objectives got taken that otherwise wouldn't have fallen. And in a war where victory came from the accumulation of thousands of small tactical successes rather than any single decisive action, those marginal improvements mattered profoundly. The historical record barely documents this technique. You won't find reversed slope climbing mentioned in major histories of the Battle of the Bulge or the Siegfried Line campaign. Division after action reports occasionally note it in passing without elaboration. Individual tanker memoirs sometimes mention it as one detail among hundreds in a general narrative of confusion and fear. But the technique existed. The damage patterns prove it. The wreckage analysis from maintenance companies shows non-penetrating rear plate impacts at angles consistent with reversed uphill movement. The training bulletins that circulated through 1st and 3rd Armies in January and February 1945 document official recognition of the tactic. The post-war armor doctrine manuals include brief mentions of deflection angle tactics for hill assaults. Most importantly, the tankers themselves remember it. Oral histories collected in the decades after the war include dozens of accounts from Sherman crewmen who backed up hills under fire. Their descriptions are consistent: the terrifying sound of rounds impacting, the metallic screech of deflections, the desperate hope that the next round wouldn't be the one that penetrated, the relief of cresting the ridge alive when every instinct said they should be dead. These weren't men prone to exaggeration or fabrication. They were farmers and factory workers and shop clerks who'd been given 16 weeks of training and shipped overseas to fight in mechanical coffins against superior German engineering. They learned to survive not through courage alone, courage they had in abundance, but through desperate innovation born from the clear-eyed recognition that standard tactics would get them killed. The lesson transcends tank warfare. It applies anywhere human beings face lethal problems that conventional solutions can't solve. Sometimes survival requires doing exactly what feels wrong, turning your weakest armor toward the threat, aiming at empty sky instead of the visible target, trusting physics and probability over instinct and tradition. The willingness to embrace counterintuitive tactics when conventional approaches fail separates forces that adapt from forces that die, clinging to doctrine. American armored forces in World War II, whatever their technical deficiencies, proved remarkably willing to experiment with unauthorized techniques when survival demanded it. That adaptability, multiplied across thousands of small units, making thousands of desperate innovations, created resilience that German technical superiority couldn't overcome. 80 years later, the specific tactic of backing Shermans up hills has no modern application. Contemporary armor doctrine, vehicle design, and weapons technology have evolved beyond recognition from 1944. But the underlying principle remains eternally relevant. Wars are won by forces that can learn and adapt faster than their enemies, not by forces with better equipment specifications. The Sherman crews who reversed up those frozen hillsides in the Ardennes proved that technical inferiority isn't destiny. That inferior armor can sometimes defeat superior weapons through superior tactics. That desperate men under fire can innovate solutions that trained engineers never conceived. That survival sometimes requires trusting physics over instinct, even when physics says do something that feels like suicide. Mike Romano survived the Panzer War. He went home to Pittsburgh, worked 33 years in a steel mill, raised 4 children, and never talked much about his time in France. When his grandson interviewed him in 1997 for a high school history project, Romano mentioned backing up hills under fire. His grandson asked why that worked. Romano shrugged and said something about angles and luck, that he didn't really understand the physics, just knew that guys who reversed up slopes seemed to take more deflections than guys who didn't. That's the real story behind the technique. Not brilliant officers applying scientific principles, but terrified men trying whatever might keep them alive one more day. The fact that their desperate improvisation aligned with ballistics theory was fortunate. The fact that they were willing to try something untested and counterintuitive in the first place was what mattered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your FLIRs screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.